Hi, I'm Glenn Rogers, and this is Biblical Insights. The title of our video today is Jesus Ministry Part 12. We're in a series where we're using the Gospel of Mark to go section by section through that Gospel and see what Mark has to tell us about the life and ministry of Jesus. And this section today is the last one in the second chapter of Mark, and we'll be looking at verses 23 through 28 today. And this is another text about religious tradition. Now, we touched on that last time, but we'll talk about it some more today, and I'll say some different things than I said last time. But I do want to reiterate the idea that tradition all by itself is not wrong or bad in any way at all. In fact, studies have shown that traditions can be a very good thing. Family traditions, cultural traditions, things like that, that they have a positive influence. But what we also see is that sometimes religious traditions, if they're not handled just correctly, just right, then they can become problematic and they can do more harm than they do good. And in the text we're going to read today, here in just a moment, we'll see how that can happen. Okay? So we're going to be reading from the Simplified New Testament, Mark chapter 2, verses 23 through 28. One Sabbath, Jesus and his followers were walking along a path that cut through a grain field. His followers pulled some of the grain off the stalks and ate it raw. The religious leaders saw this and questioned Jesus. "Why are you letting them break the Sabbath law?" they asked. Jesus answered, "Have you not read in the scriptures about what David and his soldiers did when they were hungry? It was when Abiathar was high priest. David and his men went into the house of God and ate the ceremonial bread only the priests were supposed to eat." Then Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made to benefit people, not to burden them. Besides, I am Lord of the Sabbath." Now, there's some very important ideas in this text, and so we need to take a minute to understand exactly what happened. Okay, first, it was on the Sabbath. The Sabbath is the seventh day. It's Saturday. The first day of the week was Sunday. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Saturday was the Sabbath, and it was a day of rest. They weren't supposed to work on the Sabbath, and the old law, in helping them understand what that meant, don't work on the Sabbath, had given some examples of the sorts of things they weren't supposed to do. And then, over the years, the Jews had come up with quite a lengthy list of additional things to make it very, very clear what you're not supposed to do on the Sabbath when you're obeying the Ten Commandment part of it that said, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. 6 days you work, on the seventh day you don't work, you rest. Okay, so Jesus is with his disciples on the Sabbath, and they're walking probably from one village to another village. And as they did, they cut through someone's grain field. Now, the law allowed for this. They weren't breaking any rules or any laws by cutting through a field. And the law allowed that if you're going through a field or around a field or whatever, if there's a stalk of grain growing up, if you want to pull the grain off of that and have it in your hand, that you're allowed to do that. Okay, so they weren't breaking any law. It wasn't considered, stealing or anything like that. Now, if the grain is close enough to harvest time, it's mature enough, it's good to eat, Okay, and so they would pull it off the stalk, but then it had the husk on it. And so what they would do is they would rub it in their hands like this to loosen up the husk, and then blow the husk away. And then this left them a handful of raw grain that they could eat. And so they ate it. Okay? Now, that was all perfectly legal. Nobody was breaking any laws or violating any rules or anything like that. Well, the religious leaders saw them doing this, and they went to Jesus and said basically, hey, you're letting them break the Sabbath law. Now, why did they interpret it that way? Because they interpreted that when you pulled the grain off the stalk, so you had it in your hand, you were harvesting. And that's work. And when you rubbed it together and then blew the husk away, you were threshing. And so, according to their interpretation of the rules, Jesus' disciples were engaging in harvesting and threshing, and that's obviously work. They were working on the Sabbath, therefore they were breaking the Sabbath law. Now, if you have much of a brain at all, you know that what they did not constitute work. Okay? That's kind of like saying you go out to your mailbox, to see if there's any mail in there, and you open the mailbox and you get the mail out and close the mailbox, and you notice the newspapers laying on the ground, and so you pick up the newspaper and carry it in the house. And someone says, you're working. You did work today. Well, not really. Okay, that's not considered work. You just picked up the newspaper and carried it in. That's not work, right? Now, I know many of you who are listening to this live in Africa, and you don't maybe have a mailbox and you don't get a newspaper delivered to your house or anything like that, but we do here in America. So maybe you've seen a movie or something where you understand what I'm talking about. Same for people who live in India, although there are places in India where you have a mailbox and mail gets delivered, and newspapers maybe as well. So you probably get the illustration, even if it isn't exactly true for your own situation. The disciples were not working, they were not harvesting, they were not threshing, they weren't breaking any law. But Jesus didn't bother to explain that or point that out. Instead, he said, hey, guys, have you forgotten the story about David? When Abiathar was the priest, David and his men were hungry, and what did they do? They went into the tabernacle, and they ate the bread that they weren't supposed to eat. Only the priest could eat that bread, but they ate it anyway. He says, how come you don't gripe about David doing that? That was clearly a violation of the law. They did what the law said they should not do. There's nothing in the law that says my disciples can't take a handful of grain and eat it if they want. See, that's what Jesus was implying. David clearly broke the law, but you're not criticizing him. My disciples haven't broken any rules, but you're criticizing them. Okay, so this isn't right. He said, the Sabbath wasn't made to be a burden for people. It was made to benefit people. And then he says something really important. He says, besides, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, that's a pretty big statement. What did he mean? What was he saying? Well, to keep this as short as possible, what he was saying is, I created the Sabbath. I'm the one who created and established the law of Moses. I did all that. I gave the Sabbath law. The Sabbath is mine. I can do what I want on the Sabbath. I'm in charge of the Sabbath. It's mine. Now, what are the implications of that? Well, the clear implications are that Jesus is God. Because the Mosaic law came from God. And if Jesus is saying, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, he's saying, it's my Sabbath. I created it. I established it. I can do what I want to on the Sabbath. The rules are mine. I made them. I can change them if I want. And of course, in his ministry, and this is something that we'll be talking about more as we go through the Gospel of Mark, in his ministry, Jesus was in the process of setting aside the Mosaic covenant and getting ready for the establishment of the new covenant. And that's part of what he's doing. We'll see this again in a very, very clear fashion in excuse me, I'm sorry, I still have a leftover cough excuse me, from when I was sick a few weeks ago. In chapter 7, Jesus will be setting aside some other Old Covenant regulations, and Mark will be explaining what he was doing there. So Jesus was in the process of setting aside the Old Covenant, getting ready to establish the New Covenant, and he was claiming that he was God. He was the Lord of the Sabbath. If he wanted to change it, he could. Of course, the fact was, his disciples weren't doing anything wrong. They weren't breaking the Sabbath law. But the religious leaders weren't really understanding the whole context of what was happening. And see, that's one of the problems with religious traditions. It's not wrong to have a religious tradition, but when you elevate the tradition so high to where it becomes equal with or the same as law, then it becomes a problem. You see, the law said, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. Don't work on the Sabbath. And then the Jews came along, excuse me, and started defining what it means, don't work. And they decided that if you pull grain off of a stalk and rub it to get the husk off and blow the husk away so you can eat the raw grain, that constitutes work. Well, according to Jesus, they were wrong. But you see, they took their opinion and elevated it up to the same level as the law of God. They took their tradition and elevated it up to the same level as the law of God. You can't do that. You have to understand that it's fine to have an opinion, but your opinion isn't the same as God's law. And it's fine to have a tradition, but you have to understand your tradition isn't the same as God's law. See, and that's the mistake that they made. They had elevated their opinions and their traditions up to the same level as God's law. And they said, if you violate our traditions, you're violating the law of God. If you violate our opinions, you're violating the law of God. What they were doing was making themselves equal with God. And Jesus wasn't having any of that. So that's one of the challenges of having religious traditions. You have to be really, really careful to keep in mind that these are just traditions. This is not the law of God. These are just traditions. Let me give you an example. In the fellowship I am part of and that I grew up in and that I've been preaching and teaching in for over 50 years, we grew up with the tradition that you not only go to church on Sunday morning, but you go back again on Sunday evening. For us, it was always 6 o'clock. And you go on Wednesday evening at 7 or 7:30 for Bible classes. Okay? So you didn't go to church just once a week. You went 3 times a week. Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. Now, most people understand that in the scriptures in the New Testament, what you can find is disciples meeting for worship at some time on Sunday. Sometimes they met very, very early in the morning before dawn because Sunday was not a holiday then. Everybody had to work on Sunday. And so they would get up very early and meet and have church Sunday morning before the workday began. Then they would go to work. And in some cases, they would have it later in the day. And if they were Jews, since Sunday actually began at 6 o'clock on Saturday night. See, our days go from midnight to midnight. Theirs went from 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. Okay? So if they met Saturday night at 7 or 8, for them that was Sunday. And then on Sunday at 6 p.m., it was now Monday. So they wouldn't meet on Sunday night because it wasn't Sunday night for them. For them, it was Monday morning. See, a little bit of difference between their culture and ours. But when I was growing up, 1950s, 60s, 70s, all through, even till today, if you wanted to be considered, a Christian in good standing in this church, you come Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. And there were some people who said, you have to do that. Well, many of us understood, no, we don't have to do that. Sunday morning is what is required. Sunday night is not required. Wednesday night's not required. Now, there's nothing wrong with going back Sunday night and Wednesday night, or any other time. You can go as often as you want, do what you want. That's fine. But can you make it a law and require that everybody has to do this? No. You have to understand, church on Sunday evening and Wednesday evening is a tradition, not a requirement. Okay? So that's an example of tradition, even today, that can be, elevated too high to the point where you're expected to obey and to be there. And I know people who actually say, if the elders say you should be back on Sunday night, then by George, you better be there on Sunday night. You have to obey the elder. Well, see, that's a misunderstanding of the Bible, of biblical authority for elders, and of just all sorts of things. That's very problematic because traditions can generate a lot of misunderstandings. Another problem that traditions can cause is shallowness, a lack of spiritual maturity, because we fall into this routine of a tradition. We get up, we go to church at a certain time on a certain day, and we do this, and then we walk out and we go, see there, I did what I'm supposed to do. Well, but is that really all you're supposed to be doing? Is there more to being a Christian and having a relationship with God than just going to church on Sunday morning and partaking of the Lord's Supper? Well, of course there's more to it than that. You see, if you get into this idea that if I do the traditions, if I do these things that the church says, here's what I'm supposed to do, then I'm okay. I'm good with God. I'm okay. Well, you may not be. See, if it's just an outward motion, if you're just going through the motion, doing the traditions, then that's not what God wants, and that's not acceptable to God. So, traditions are not wrong, but traditions can cause some serious problems if we don't recognize traditions for what they are. Traditions. Okay? And they're good things in some contexts. They're very good. They're beneficial. They're helpful. Even religious traditions. But if you don't recognize that they are just traditions and that they're not the law of God and that they don't make us right with God, then they can become serious problems. So we need to pay attention to what we're doing. That's the real lesson here. Pay attention to what you're doing. Now, think about that for a few days, okay? Think about the idea that you need to pay attention to your religious life. Give it the priority it deserves. So while you're doing that, read your Bible, pray, go to church, and may God bless.